Hello and welcome to this week's podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about fear and all the emotions that are attached to change and progress. We're so glad that you are with us today. Gareth, why don't you share with us a brief summary of what you shared with us on Sunday?
So on Sunday we spoke about fear, and fear is something that all of us deal with. It can kind of be something that limits us in our lives, that holds us back from the full potential of what God has for us. And on Sunday we unpacked 4 keys or 4 steps which you can apply to your life, really to overcome fear and to move forward. And I think one of the big things, the most important things, is that often our greatest fear is a little bit different to our most limiting fear. So what is your greatest fear?
My greatest fear?
Bananas. I think Amy's greatest fear is probably bananas. Doesn't like bananas. Mine is, I think, snakes. I would say I don't like snakes. But those fears, like bananas and snakes, that's not your most limiting fear. The most limiting fear would be things like
people pleasing,
failure, fear of rejection. What are other people going to think? So got to separate, identify what is your most limiting fear, and the most important thing is that you won't change what you won't confront. So if you want to deal with fear, you have to be willing to deal with it and face it so that things can change.
And as a culture, we tend to be fearful of emotions in general.
Emotions can be really scary, let's be honest. It can be hard to deal with your emotions, and probably scary because you don't know what you're going to find when you start digging into your emotions.
And people don't want to be vulnerable. People are afraid of being vulnerable, and your emotions show vulnerability.
So why is that?
Why is that? People pleasing?
Yeah,
fear of what people
fear
think.
Of what people are going to think. I also think it has a lot to do with what we've been told when we grew up in our formative years, the narratives we've been told. Maybe you grew up in a house where it was something
Cowboys
like
don't cry.
Cowboys don't cry, or go to your room and come out when you've stopped crying, or life is difficult, so just suck it up.
Yeah.
What would another one be?
As far as everybody knows, we're a nice, normal family.
Yes,
so
let's just act normal, and everyone will think that we are fine. It doesn't matter what you feel; it matters what you do. So everything becomes about function
and don't show people your weakness.
So, yes, because emotions can be seen as a weakness, and vulnerability, being vulnerable, open about your emotions or processing them, can be seen as a weakness. And in fact, none of that is true. And really, to ignore your emotions and the things that you're feeling is to ignore reality, because we all have emotions. God has created us with emotions.
And we see that even Jesus had emotions, so
Jesus
why should we be any different?
He was a super emotional person. You read his life story in the Gospels and you see the extent of emotions that he had, but we can learn from him of how he processed them. So I think really what we want to do is try and normalize emotions, and to help each of us to take a step towards emotional maturity, to grow up in our emotions, if that makes sense. Because the trouble is, if we don't deal with our emotions, it's if you take a 2-liter Coke bottle and you shake it up, and you shake it, and eventually you open the lid, what happens?
There's a big fat mess.
There's a big fat mess on you and anyone close to you.
Yeah.
And suppressing emotions or avoiding emotions is kind of like over time, it just gets more and more ready to explode, and then suddenly you explode over everybody and those close to you, and it's a big mess.
And we heard a statistic recently about how when we suppress our emotions, that often depression over time comes from a suppressed emotion that we suppressed years ago. So this compounding suppressed emotion can lead to further mental health difficulties like depression, anxiety, etc., because we're not taught to deal with our emotions
in a healthy way. Taught maybe not to feel emotions,
or just to suppress them
and
the Coke bottle.
The truth of the gospel is God invites us into a story where our emotions are dealt with. In fact, every area of our lives. There's a verse which I shared on Sunday, Philippians 2:12, where it says, he says, hey, work out your own fear. Or your own, we're working out our fear here. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. So that's kind of our part. There's a responsibility on us to work out what God is working into us. But then he finishes it, and he says, he who started a good work in you is faithful and will bring it to completion. So there's a partnership between us and God. There's responsibility for us to take a step to deal with the stuff that's going on inside of us. But then also God's part is he's faithful and he's good, and he will bring the good work to completion.
So we shouldn't base our emotional health and dealing with emotions on what we've been taught by society and the world around us, but actually by God and how
Yes.
Jesus dealt with his emotions with God. Even David was this hugely emotional being. And
I mean, one third of the Psalms is laments. It's like this cry of his heart. So you read through all the Psalms, they're incredibly emotional, and we can learn from that.
Yeah.
One of the problems that we all face is this breaking this mindset of good and bad emotions.
Yeah.
So what is a good emotion?
I don't know, because I think all emotions are good. If I sit with people and they burst into tears, I'm actually happy. I know that sounds really malicious, but I think it's a really good thing. I always encourage people, that's cool. I'll get tissues, have a cry. We're going to work through this thing. So I don't see that there is a good and a bad emotion. I think that there's just negative or positive.
I think you've already made the jump to where we want to get to in that a lot of us think that there are good and bad emotions. So what you're saying is correct, is emotions are neither good nor bad. They are there for a reason.
Yeah.
But many of us think that there are good emotions and bad emotions, and good emotions are the ones that make you feel nice, and bad emotions are emotions like fear or guilt or shame or just feeling down and heavy, whatever
Sadness,
those things
yeah.
are. Sadness. And what we tend to try and do is avoid those emotions that we classify as bad or negative emotions and lean into the positive emotions because they make us feel better. But I think a better way to think of emotions is as nice emotions and not nice emotions. In themselves, they're neither good nor bad, but they are indicators.
So when we feel an emotion, we don't classify it as good or bad, but we say, what is this emotion telling me? So it could be telling me that I'm sad, so perhaps you're sad because change has happened or whatever, and actually that's okay. It's all right to feel sad, but if we suppress it, it comes out later. It comes out in our behavior, how we treat people perhaps, instead of actually just dealing with that sadness, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just an indicator that something is lost. There's something's different.
Something needs
lost.
to be dealt with. So if you're feeling some kind of emotion and you actually pay attention to what's going on, because often that's another thing. We're like so busy, we just distract ourselves, avoid leaning into the not nice emotions because we want to feel better and feel happy. But if you slow down enough to pay attention to what's actually going on there, it shows you here's an area where God probably wants to do some work in your life. Like fear is an indicator emotion. If you're fearful of something, it points you towards an area where some work needs to be done.
And talking about being too busy to actually process our emotions, there's a psychologist that speaks about how we should just like we focus on our physical health and our mental health, we should actually focus on our emotional health and do emotional cleansing. So if you broke your leg, you would go to hospital and get it fixed. But if you are fearful or sad, we suppress it instead of actually getting it fixed. And getting it fixed can look like just having a good cry or telling somebody, I feel fearful of the future, or I feel fearful of whatever. And just that cleansing, that continuous talking about our emotions, allowing our emotions out, brings about a huge change within our emotional and mental health.
So I think you've highlighted something which is another barrier to dealing with our emotions, is actually naming them. I won't speak on behalf of women, but at least for guys, like our emotions probably are, how are you doing? Good or not so good? And those are not real answers to really like what emotions are you feeling.
So I think a really helpful habit to get into is to go through a process of emotionally cleansing, regularly dealing with our emotions and cleansing, getting rid of them, and processing them well.
And one of the things that you mentioned in that, or it points to a problem that many of us face, is actually naming our emotions.
Yes.
Because you can't deal with what you don't name.
Yes.
But as soon as something is named, you can start to process it and deal
because
with
we're not taught to process our emotions, we actually don't know how to name them accurately.
So our general description for emotions might be, I'm good, or I'm not good, or I'm bad.
Okay.
I'm okay. I'm fine. We hear that a lot. How are you
Yes.
doing? I'm fine.
Or I'm busy.
And those
Which
are
is not
not
an emotion.
those are not really emotions. Well, they're not emotions.
Yeah.
Good and bad are not emotions. Fine is not an emotion. So there's a very helpful tool called the emotions wheel. And if you print one out for yourself, you can keep that with you in your journal. And when you're feeling something, actually have a look through the wheel and try to identify specifically what is the emotion that you are feeling.
Yeah, and what I like about it is it starts quite simple: angry, sad, happy, and then so perhaps you're feeling happy and you want to describe better what that happiness is. Then you'll choose happy, and then that branches out to something else, and then you might actually realize,
gives you a little more detail,
yes,
like you get different levels of happiness.
I'm not actually happy, I'm excited,
Yeah.
or I'm joyful, and so it gives you the names of the emotions that you
Or you might be feeling sad, and you actually find out as you dig into it more that you're grieving a loss that perhaps you're not even aware of.
Yeah.
So it's just a helpful tool, and you get various different ones, but there's a link in the caption of the video, and you can download your own emotions wheel and put it to good use in starting to name your emotions.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we see, like how this works practically, is in the story of Jesus just before he goes to the cross. Is the safest space to deal with your emotions is before God.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Jesus did. And we said earlier that God is not surprised by your emotions. He knows what you're feeling. But it's our responsibility to actually face what's going on inside of us in the presence of God. And Jesus is a great example of how to do that.
Yeah, so an example of that is actually just to sit before God and say, I'm feeling these feelings, and pour out your heart like David did in the Psalms, like we spoke about. Or last week we spoke about journaling. So take your emotions wheel, write a prayer to God, or write your emotions down, and take it to Jesus. Let him help you to process them.
And here's the why. This is why this is so key, is because we all need to grow in different areas of our life, and emotions is one of them. So we can be really good at doing all kinds of things, like successful in business, leading a family well, doing all kinds of spiritual things, reading the Bible, going to church, going to life group, reading all kinds of Christian books and all those kind of things. Just be like frantically busy with good things, but yet at the same time be emotionally immature.
Yeah.
And being emotionally immature, some of the signs of that is just feeling completely overwhelmed often, having emotional outbursts, snapping at the people that are close to you. There's a whole bunch of signs.
Feeling of desperation.
Loneliness, all these kind of things. Just suddenly getting angry for whatever reason. All of these can be indicators of emotional immaturity where there's room to grow. Road rage. Yeah, that could be one as well. So it's just part of the journey to emotional health. So the idea is to have perhaps more of a balanced life where we're not just excelling in some areas, but actually our emotions are in a healthy place too. And it's good for you to be emotionally healthy because it reduces stress in your life.
Yeah, and again, we want to see a holistic self and healthy in every area of our lives. So this is emotional health is just an element of your life. So physical, emotional, all those things. So this is just one of those that needs attention from time to time.
So some really practical things for you to take away from this podcast. 1, get yourself an emotions wheel if you haven't got one yet. 2, I recommend a book called Running on Empty, Overcoming Your Childhood Emotional Neglect by Jonas Webb. It's an incredibly intense read, but hugely, hugely insightful. And I think I'd encourage you just to take some time to work through that.
And have a coffee with a friend. And tell them how you really are.
How you really are.
That goes a long way.
Yeah,
how you really are.
One conversation where there's vulnerability builds so much more intimacy than hours of conversations about anything else.
Yeah. If this was helpful to you, don't forget to like, to subscribe, and to click on the bell icon so that you don't miss future resources from us. Thank you so much.